When you think of the name Wolfenstein, which developer immediately pops in your head? For me at least, it's id Software, of course, as they designed the legendary Wolfenstein 3D, the game that essentially gave birth to the first-person shooter genre, and the game that laid the groundwork for Doom and Quake to follow. However, it's common knowledge at this point that id Software didn't even create the Wolfenstein property, and instead merely revived it with Wolfenstein 3D. Then id went on to make Doom, and the rest is pretty much history. Wolfenstein 3D did get a follow-up in the form of Spear of Destiny, which was basically a glorified level pack with some updated textures, new music, and new enemies to deal with. Spear of Destiny was fine enough, and even that game had 2 mission packs that were released later, but Wolfenstein 3D didn't get the proper continuation it deserved until 2001. Return to Castle Wolfenstein acted as a semi-remake / sequel to Wolfenstein 3D, but it was developed by Grey Matter Interactive and not id Software this time. Grey Matter previously worked on Redneck Rampage, which is not a good sign in the slightest, but luckily Return to Castle Wolfenstein turned out fantastic. Covering that game alone is worthy of a separate video, but suffice to say, many people consider it the best Wolfenstein game for good reason. So Return to Castle Wolfenstein was released 9 years after the last game, so hopefully the wait wasn't as long for the next mainline Wolfenstein entry to come out. No, it still took them almost a fucking decade. This new game was released in 2009 and was just called Wolfenstein. It received a meh reaction from critics and suffered from low sales, resulting in Activision laying off Raven Software employees. Even when the fucking game launched, Activision laid off a chunk of the Wolfenstein multiplayer team. Wolfenstein 2009 seemed to be cursed, and nowadays there's no way to even buy the game without getting a pre-owned copy or pirating it. Bethesda has not re-released Wolfenstein 2009 yet, and that's weird to me considering that characters who make their debut in the game also show up in Bethesda's Wolfenstein reboot series. Wolfenstein 2009 is an interesting game to talk about, but not necessarily because of what it has to offer though. You can't buy this game anymore, and the game sold poorly are 2 statements that you'll most likely hear regarding Wolfenstein. But what is the game actually like? Well, the game was developed by Raven Software, and before they tackled Wolfenstein 2009, they made another follow-up to an iconic FPS series with Quake 4. Now, Quake 4's primary shooting mechanics are good, but the movement speed and the way you traverse around the space is kinda too slow, and the same thing can be said about Wolfenstein. Wolfenstein has great gunplay, which should be expected from a game produced by id Software. That being said, I wish the mobility was better handled, as I felt like I was taking a brisk walk around Nazi Germany as opposed to running and gunning knee-deep in the middle of war. Quake 4 had the same problem, at least until the strugification section later on in the game, and Wolfenstein has a similar fix with the Veil power-up system. Yeah, so you know how the Wolfenstein games have always kinda been supernatural? Well, Wolfenstein 2009 leans into that even more with something called the Thule Medallion, which is discovered by BJ in the opening cutscene. This medallion gives BJ the ability to slow down time, raise up a shield to protect himself from gunfire, increase his gun's damage output, and also enter the Veil realm. Most of these abilities are useful, particularly in the endgame combat areas, and are required for the occasional puzzle sections. The Veil realm is what I want to focus on though, as that allows the player to move quicker. But that means that every time you're not in Veil mode, you just feel handicapped with the slowish movement speed. At least more often than not, you're in this Veil realm, and the game gives you plenty of energy to keep the power-up switched on. Wolfenstein is an improvement on Quake 4 in that regard, and the fact that you can use the medallion in like the 2nd level is also good. I just wish that the faster movement speed you get in the Veil was the default movement speed. I mean, this is a Wolfenstein game after all. Fast-paced gameplay should be the standard. The gunplay itself is pretty damn good, and the weapons you get are fun to play around with. Of course, the main workhorse weapon, the MP40, is here, and spraying a bunch of Nazi soldiers with it never gets old. However, there's more experimental weapons like the flamethrower, which does what you would expect, the particle cannon that shoots out a beam of energy and disintegrates enemies, the Tesla gun, which fires a wild burst of electricity out and it looks fantastic, and like in every id game, the B-Tech BFG weapon is here too. All of those guns are rather situational, which having that kind of weapon roster is always a good thing in an FPS game. My favourite weapon is the Tesla gun for sure, because it actually feels like an untested piece of Nazi equipment when you use it. The way that the electricity launches out erratically and how the enemies flip over when you take them out with it. It's fucking amazing. The gunplay is nice and all, but it's a shame that the game includes regenerating health rather than a set health bar. I don't hate the regenerating health system that much in games, as I even enjoy titles that have it like Call of Duty, but man, it would have been awesome to see health packs and armor in Wolfenstein 2009. Having an old school health system adds a whole new level of strategy within combat, and it forces players to think about the most effective way to kill a horde of enemies, to hit the opposition and then not get hit yourself. Thank God you can carry all weapons at once though, and that this modern shooter trope hasn't infected its way into this game. There's plenty of cool guns to shoot, I want to use them all, and I'm so glad that you can easily swap between them without any hassle. Wolfenstein 2009 also features an upgrade shop, which is a cool addition to the series, but it ultimately doesn't affect a whole lot. Still though, Raven Software tried to give the fans something new, and that is commendable. Before we talk about the level design, I think the story should be mentioned at least. So there's a story in Wolfenstein 2009, and it's pretty much what you'd expect. Nazis have invaded the town of Eisenstadt so that they can mine the materials required to access the Black Sun dimension. They are still experimenting with dark magic and the occult, and they obviously want to take over the world with it. BJ is assisted by two separate ally factions this time around, to stop the Nazis' plans. As mentioned before, certain characters from this game like Caroline Becker return in the new Wolfenstein reboot series, and BJ has black fucking hair for some reason, which is definitely the most important thing to note here. Thank fuck that they fixed it back to blonde in the new order. That's the basic gist, and all I can say is that the story is definitely Wolfenstein, through and through. If we take a look at Quake 4 again, that game is a very linear single-player experience. It guides the player along every step of the way, and for a shooter that was released in 2005, that's pretty standard. Quake 4 has set levels, whereas Wolfenstein attempts to break the mold by having an open hub world. Instead of playing level after level, the player has to travel to each main story mission using this hub, and to be honest, it gets rather grating by the end of the game. When you're in the hub, you often get ambushed by a group of Nazi enemies, and after a while, you just try to brush past them instead of taking them out. I appreciate that Raven was attempting to do something different, and the hub world idea was adopted by id Software with Rage, but a linear mission structure would have worked out so much better. For the most part, the levels themselves are really well done, and they have plenty of cool action pieces. The initial train station sequence is everything you'd want from a Wolfenstein level. When the Nazis look inside to find you and the rest of your squad, then that turns into a big firefight outside the station. It's so good. Yeah, there's a small mediocre turret section right in the middle of the level, but it's so brief that I literally forgot about it. The part when the train container explodes is kinda genius when I look back at it. The excess veil energy makes everyone, including the player and all of the objects in the room, float up into the sky, and that little moment leaves you curious about the source of the blue energy and its properties. Plus, it feels great when you mow down a Nazi that's trapped and suspended in the air. After the train station, you get introduced to the hub world, which sucks, but at least the enemies that spawn aren't that annoying to take out at this point in the campaign. I just feel like they had a 4 to 5 hour campaign and wanted to pad things out a bit. hence why there's an almost useless hub. Sure, you can find a handful of timed side quests, but they don't completely justify the hub world, and also the main story missions are what count in the end, so that's what I spent my time pursuing. It's cool that they at least tried to do something different, since the Wolfenstein games up until this point followed a linear level by level format, but I'm stuck here thinking, don't fix what isn't broken. The second level takes place down in a Nazi dig site, and this is where you can access the Thule Medallion's powers. So as you could probably expect, there's plenty of obstacles and puzzles in this level that requires the Veil powers to overcome. There's a new sorcerer enemy introduced in the dig site, and he's a guy that you love to hate. He can shoot projectiles at you, he occasionally blocks your fire, and he can also raise shields up for the other enemies. He's a pain in the arse, but he's a necessary and solid enemy to have in the game, as he does alter the way you think about the battle, and he becomes a huge priority target. In the later sections of the game, he can be annoying to deal with, but that's kind of a point, and I ultimately like the sorcerer's inclusion. All of the levels in this game are very linear, and with the exception of trying to find intel and gold, which is optional anyway, you won't be exploring much in them. That's fine by me, as each level focuses on giving the player cool, action-packed moments, and their campaign is only bogged down by some of the boss fights, a couple of poorly explained puzzle solutions, and of course the hub world, which I've already talked about. The rundown church is the next place you visit in the main story, and this level is kinda forgettable, as it features a similar backdrop to the hub. That being said, the heavy trooper makes its first appearance, and you need to shoot all 3 of his weak points to blow him up. I like how he keeps the player occupied, so that allows the weakened Nazi soldiers to take shots at you, but when you manage to take him out, the blue explosion effect that occurs after is amazing. All of the Nazi dark science stuff in Wolfenstein 2009 is really cool, and aside from maybe Return to Castle Wolfenstein, I appreciate how this game ramps up the occult aspect way more than other games in the series. The boss fight at the end of the stage is pretty much a bullet sponge that runs around the church tossing fireballs at you. Nothing too difficult or special about him, but I don't mind the simplicity in this boss fight. The farm is when this game clicked for me, at least for the time being. It's at this point where the developers really want you to use the Veil a ton within combat, and yeah, it's a great time. Using the slow motion ability to destroy a line of soldiers and going to the Veil realm to get a better look at your targets, this level gives you plenty of energy to do that, and it's real fun. I love how the level begins on an innocent looking farm, then as you go down deeper and deeper, you discover an underground Nazi base. I think this is awesome, and it's a good way to shake up the environment within the same level. The shield power-up for the medallion is also accessible in this level, and while I think this is the weakest ability out of the 4, and I used it the least, it's still nice to have in your back pocket for those desperate situations where enemies are swarming you with limited health. Regardless, the farm is definitely the best level in Wolfenstein 2009, and aside from the Veil Assassin reveal in the hospital, there's not much to say about the latter level. The same statement can be applied for the next level, Canary, but swap out the Veil Assassin with the Flamethrower dude, who is actually a pretty enjoyable enemy to kill. Defeating him grants you access to his weapon, obviously, and as I said before, the flamethrower does pretty much what you'd expect it to. That doesn't make it any less fucking great though. At this point in the campaign, the hub world becomes more crowded with tougher enemies, and yeah, it kinda gets annoying to traverse. Getting into the Canary level by itself is annoying, but at least we have a good level with Castle afterwards. So basically over the course of the game, Caroline is captured by the Nazis and they take her to a castle. It isn't given a proper name or anything, so fuck it, it's just a castle. BJ and the Resistance storm the castle at night, which is great, to try to rescue her. The level is heavily guarded with enemies, and in terms of sheer spectacle and set pieces, Castle is probably the best level in the game. However, I still prefer Farm as it's the more interesting level out of the two design-wise. The Rocket Trooper is a fucking nightmare though, that's gotta be said. These assholes camp out of the way and then occasionally take pot shots at you. The Rocket Trooper is one of my personal gripes with this game, and even though he only shows up a few times, thank fucking god, they still make their infuriating presence known. The boss at the end of the level features two phases. They are both awfully simple, however the first phase suffers from being too formulaic, and the second phase is overly bullet spongy, without any indicators of damage being inflicted. At the very least, the boss looks original and doesn't really resemble anything that we've seen in Wolfenstein before. The final two levels of the game are Airfield and Zeppelin. This outside area in Airfield is definitely one of the hardest sections due to the rough enemy placement and lack of solid cover. Once you get past it though, it's pretty much a cakewalk until you get up to this boss. So much shit coming after you, it gets insane. This is the second worst boss fight in the game, no doubt. It feels so artificially difficult with the constant reinforcement she spawns in. Also, there is a puzzle in Airfield that I had no idea how to complete. All you do is use the Empower ability and then blow up the barrel to get past the energy shield. That sounds easy as fuck to figure out, but there's almost no other points in the game, especially early on, which informs you that you can use Empower to shoot past shields. That is a glaring error in my opinion, and it's weird because the early levels do a pretty damn good job at telling you how the other abilities can solve puzzles, and then it has you do them over and over. Zeppelin is basically Airfield Part 2. And after those levels are done, BJ goes off to fight Hans Gross in the Black Sun Veil dimension. I said that the boss in Airfield was the second to worst boss battle, and that's because Hans Gross is fucking bullshit, unfortunately. He is such an iconic character in Wolfenstein 3D and everything, so it sucks to say that he is a crappy boss fight in this game. The final boss is obviously the last impression that the game is going to leave on you, and while I do still like Wolfenstein 2009 and all, Hans Gross did kinda leave a bad taste in my mouth for a little bit when I beat him. There's multiple phases to take care of once again, and luckily the first wave is not that bad. All the player has to do is charge up the Veil energy meter, activate Empower, and then blast him with your guns. Rinse and repeat this until the next phase begins. While yeah, it might be a little too basic for some people, I'm personally fine with this initial phase, specifically because of the artificially difficult phases that come after. The second fight with Hans Gross is needlessly hard, and that's because you enter some sort of 1v1 gunfight with him, as you need to peek behind cover and hurt him without getting hurt yourself. Easier said than fucking done, since the damage you take by his hit scan attacks is so overwhelming, and he comes into your line of sight so quickly that it's tough to hide out of the way most of the time. I almost wanted to give up after this phase, to be honest. It was that fucking frustrating. At least afterwards, you get a bit of a breather round with you climbing up the hill, dodging his gunfire, and killing a group of low-level enemies. That is until you have to pretty much do the second phase again. If you die on this final phase, you have to start back at the hill section, by the way. Yeah, sometimes the checkpoints in this game are quite reliable and plentiful, but they definitely skimped out here for some reason. Hans Gross is beyond frustrating, but Wolfenstein 2009 is still a fairly good game looking back. I'd probably play it one more time through, but that's about it. Wolfenstein 2009 is one of those games that you play once or even twice if the game really grabs you, and you move on. And oh man, this game was fucking moved on from. That's for sure. Bethesda should really consider re-releasing it, not because it's some masterpiece or anything, but because newer Wolfenstein fans deserve to be able to play it. There is quite a bit of enjoyment to be had. The actual gunplay is very satisfying, the game has a good variety of guns, from standard military equipment to the more experimental Nazi weapons, and most of the levels are linear, yet well designed. I do have my issues with the game, as I've laid out along with the aspects that I like, but fuck it. Wolfenstein 2009 is missing. It's lost. It's forgotten. It can't even be bought. So I guess we reached a stalemate.